Morty surpassing Rick is often imagined as a dramatic reversal where intelligence changes hands, power shifts visibly, and hierarchy collapses in a single moment. Canon gives no support to that version of the idea. Rick remains the most intelligent individual in any room he enters, and nothing in the series suggests Morty will exceed him in raw intellect. Yet this framing misunderstands what surpassing actually means in Rick's universe. Superiority is not determined by intelligence alone. It is determined by who can continue adapting once intelligence stops being enough. Rick has already reached his ceiling. His knowledge is vast, but it is also complete in a way that limits growth. He knows how the multiverse works, how systems fail, how people break, and how to escape consequence. What he does not do is change internally. His coping mechanisms are fixed. His worldview is closed. He solves new problems with old answers, not because they are optimal, but because they are familiar. This stagnation is invisible at first, because Rick's baseline is so high. Over time, however, it becomes his greatest weakness. Morty exists at the opposite end of that spectrum. He begins with almost no power, no knowledge, and no control. What he does have is adaptability. Each experience alters him. He integrates loss, fear, guilt, and responsibility into his decision-making. He does not reset psychologically even when the universe does. This capacity to absorb consequence without discarding it allows Morty to change in ways Rick no longer can. Surpassing Rick does not require knowing more than him. It requires remaining flexible in domains Rick has abandoned. Morty is already doing this. He learns from failure rather than escaping it. He adjusts behavior rather than environments. He modifies strategy rather than denying cost. Rick, by contrast, avoids internal revision whenever possible. His solutions are external. When something breaks, he replaces it. When a world collapses, he leaves. When a relationship deteriorates, he distances himself. These habits keep Rick functional, but prevent evolution. Canon repeatedly shows Rick encountering the same emotional problems without resolving them. His self-destructive tendencies persist. His relationships remain unstable. His reliance on control never diminishes. These patterns indicate a form of intellectual plateau. Rick has optimized survival, but not sustainability. Morty, still forming his identity, is not bound by these constraints. He is learning how to survive without destroying the parts of himself that allow growth. Evil. Morty exists as proof that the ceiling above Morty is real. He does not defeat Rick through superior genius or technology. He defeats Rick by understanding him completely. He anticipates Rick's behavior, exploits his blind spots, and removes the structures Rick relies on for dominance. This victory is not about intelligence. It is about insight. Evil Morty recognizes that Ricks are predictable because they all stopped evolving in the same way. Their arrogance locks them into patterns. Your Morty is not evil Morty, but the implication is unavoidable. Morty variants can surpass Rick if they continue adapting, while Rick remains static. Evil. Morty demonstrates that Rick's supremacy is conditional, not absolute. It depends on others behaving in ways Rick expects. Once that expectation fails, Rick's advantage narrows dramatically. Morty's growing unpredictability is one of the clearest signs of potential surpassing. Rick predicts others by assuming they will choose efficiency, self-preservation, or detachment. Morty increasingly does not. He sometimes chooses restraint over escalation, cooperation over dominance, or responsibility over escape. These choices are not irrational. They are value-driven. Rick struggles to model value-driven behavior because he abandoned that framework long ago. As a result, Morty's decisions become harder for Rick to anticipate. Unpredictability undermines Rick's greatest strength. Rick's intelligence allows him to calculate outcomes when variables behave according to known patterns. Morty's refusal to default to Rick-like shortcuts introduces noise Rick cannot easily account for. This does not make Morty smarter, but it makes him harder to outmaneuver. In complex systems, adaptability often outperforms optimization. Morty's empathy plays a central role in this process. Rick treats empathy as a liability because it complicates decision-making and introduces vulnerability. Morty learns to manage empathy rather than discard it. He does not allow it to paralyze him, but he also does not erase it. This balance enables Morty to form alliances Rick cannot maintain and resolve conflicts Rick would escalate. Canon repeatedly rewards Morty for these outcomes, even when they appear inefficient in the short term. Rick's relationships tend to collapse because they are instrumental. Morty's relationships persist because they are contextual. He understands people as variables with internal states, rather than obstacles to be removed. This social intelligence compensates for Morty's lack of technical genius. Over time, it allows Morty to navigate situations Rick would destabilize through excess control. Another critical factor is Rick's resistance to self-examination. Rick understands himself intellectually, but he avoids emotional integration. He knows why he is the way he is, but he does not allow that knowledge to change him. Morty does the opposite. He reflects, recalibrates, and alters behavior even when it is uncomfortable. This willingness to revise internal assumptions is a form of growth Rick no longer practices. Surpassing Rick, therefore, does not look like domination. It looks like relevance. Rick's intelligence solves problems, but Morty's adaptability allows him to remain viable in changing conditions. As the multiverse destabilizes and old safeguards collapse, Rick's reliance on fixed superiority becomes less reliable. Morty's capacity to adjust without certainty becomes more valuable. Canon also suggests that Rick is aware of this trajectory. His behavior toward Morty oscillates between dismissal and vigilance. He undermines Morty verbally while relying on him practically. This contradiction indicates recognition rather than ignorance. Rick understands that Morty is becoming capable in ways Rick cannot easily counter. He also understands that suppressing this growth accelerates divergence rather than preventing it. Morty surpassing Rick does not require a future event. It is already happening incrementally. Morty is not overtaking Rick in intelligence, but he is closing the gap in effectiveness. Rick remains superior in raw capability, but Morty is becoming superior in sustainability. Rick survives by escaping consequence. Morty survives by enduring it. Over time, endurance outlasts escape. The most important distinction is that Morty's growth is ongoing. Rick's is not. As long as Morty continues learning and Rick remains static, the gap will continue to narrow in domains Rick cannot reclaim. Surpassing Rick is not about winning a confrontation. It is about outgrowing a framework. Rick may always be smarter than Morty. He may always build better technology and see further ahead in abstract terms. But intelligence that cannot evolve eventually becomes brittle. Morty's strength lies in remaining malleable under pressure. That malleability is already reshaping their dynamic. The question, then, is not whether Morty will surpass Rick in some definitive sense. The question is whether Rick can adapt before Morty finishes growing. Canon offers little evidence that Rick is capable of that change. Morty, by contrast, has not stopped changing at any point. If surpassing means becoming untouchable, Morty may never surpass Rick. If surpassing means remaining functional when old advantages fail, Morty is already on that path. Rick understands this. And that understanding is why the question lingers without resolution, not because the outcome is uncertain, but because the process is already underway. That process continues quietly, without announcing itself through victories or confrontations. Morty's progression does not follow a straight line toward dominance. It unfolds through accumulation, through small recalibrations that compound over time. Each situation Morty survives without defaulting to Rick's methods expands the gap between what Rick can do and what Morty can become. Rick's intelligence remains overwhelming, but intelligence alone does not guarantee leverage. Rick solves problems by controlling variables. Morty increasingly solves problems by reframing them. Where Rick looks for the fastest exit, Morty looks for the least destructive path forward. This difference matters more as situations grow more complex. High intelligence excels in closed systems. Adaptability excels in open ones. The multiverse, increasingly unstable and unpredictable, favors the latter. Morty's capacity to endure ambiguity is another domain where surpassing becomes plausible. Rick despises ambiguity because it limits calculation. He resolves uncertainty by force, escape, or erasure. Morty tolerates uncertainty. He waits, observes, and adjusts. This patience allows information to surface that Rick often overrides through escalation. In systems where not everything can be known in advance, patience becomes a competitive advantage. Rick's relationship with failure further highlights the contrast. Failure threatens Rick's identity, so he avoids it by redefining success or abandoning the context in which failure occurred. Morty accepts failure as instructive. He carries its lessons forward rather than escaping them. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. Morty improves through friction. Rick preserves stasis through avoidance. Improvement eventually overtakes preservation. Canon repeatedly reinforces that Rick's greatest blind spots are emotional rather than intellectual. He miscalculates when attachment, loyalty, or empathy influence outcomes. Morty, precisely because he retains these elements, can anticipate responses Rick overlooks. This does not make Morty more intelligent, but it makes him more accurate in social systems. Accuracy, not raw intellect, determines effectiveness in those contexts. As Morty continues to refine this skill set, Rick's predictive models lose precision. Rick predicts behavior by projecting his own priorities outward. Morty's priorities diverge increasingly. He values containment over conquest, survival over dominance, and continuity over escape. These values lead to decisions Rick would not make, and therefore cannot always predict. Each unpredictable choice erodes Rick's strategic advantage incrementally. Rick attempts to compensate for this erosion by increasing control elsewhere. He builds more, safeguards, automates more responses, and distances himself emotionally. These measures preserve short-term dominance, but accelerate long-term brittleness. Systems built to avoid adaptation eventually fail when conditions change faster than defenses can update. Morty, operating without rigid frameworks, adapts more fluidly. Morty's ability to function without total control also reshapes how others interact with him. He becomes easier to trust, easier to work with, and harder to dismiss. Rick often alienates allies through contempt or manipulation. Morty maintains connections by acknowledging cost and limitation. These connections become resources Rick cannot easily replicate. Influence replaces intimidation. Cooperation replaces coercion. This shift does not eliminate Rick's advantages, but it contextualizes them. Rick remains unmatched in technological improvisation and abstract problem-solving. Morty becomes competitive in judgment, timing, and restraint. The overlap between these domains grows. In situations where brute intelligence is insufficient, Morty's approach becomes more reliable. Rick is not oblivious to this trend. His oscillation between mockery and reliance reflects an awareness that Morty is no longer just surviving by proximity. Morty contributes meaningfully to outcomes. Rick's dismissiveness becomes performative rather than corrective. He maintains hierarchy rhetorically, even as behavior undermines it. Morty's surpassing of Rick, if it occurs, will not register as a clear transfer of power. It will register as Rick finding fewer situations where his approach is unquestionably superior. Each time Morty resolves a problem with less collateral, less escalation, or less loss, the definition of effectiveness shifts. Rick's methods remain impressive, but not always optimal. This gradual reframing aligns with the show's broader themes. Intelligence divorced from growth becomes self-limiting. Adaptability grounded in experience becomes expansive. Morty embodies the latter trajectory. Rick embodies the former. Their coexistence allows this contrast to play out without forcing resolution. Morty does not need to defeat Rick to surpass him. He only needs to remain viable in scenarios Rick cannot easily navigate. As those scenarios increase, Morty's relative advantage grows. Rick's supremacy becomes situational rather than universal. Whether Morty eventually surpasses Rick depends less on Morty's growth than on Rick's capacity for change. Canon consistently portrays Rick as resistant to internal evolution. Morty, by contrast, has not stopped evolving at any point. As long as that asymmetry persists, the trajectory remains clear, even without a destination. The question is not who will be greater. The question is whose way of surviving will continue to work when the rules change again. That movement forward reframes what surpassing even looks like within the story. It stops being about hierarchy and starts being about relevance under changing conditions. Rick's relevance has always been tied to control. When he can dominate the variables, he is unmatched. When control fragments, his advantage narrows. Morty's relevance, by contrast, is tied to continuity. He remains effective even when certainty disappears. As instability increases, that difference matters more. Rick's problem is not lack of intelligence, but overcommitment to a solved identity. He knows who he is and what works for him, and that knowledge has calcified into habit. Habit becomes vulnerability when circumstances evolve. Morty does not yet have a fixed identity. His sense of self is still forming, still responsive to new information. This plasticity allows Morty to absorb shocks. Rick deflects rather than processes. Over time, absorbed shocks become insight. Canon repeatedly shows Rick encountering situations where his usual tools still function, but produce diminishing returns. Escalation solves the immediate threat, but leaves deeper instability behind. Morty increasingly notices this pattern. He begins evaluating not just whether a solution works, but whether it compounds future problems. This systems-level thinking emerges from lived consequence, rather than abstract theory. Rick understands systems conceptually. Morty understands them experientially. That experiential understanding gives Morty an advantage in environments where rules are unclear or shifting. Rick thrives in systems with discoverable logic. Morty adapts in systems with emotional, social, or moral volatility. As the series progresses, those volatile systems become more common. Institutions collapse. Alliances fracture. Structures Rick relied on lose coherence. In those spaces, Morty's tolerance for ambiguity becomes functional. Rick's attempts to restore dominance often involve simplifying complexity through force or removal. Morty increasingly attempts to stabilize complexity through compromise or containment. These approaches lead to different outcomes. Rick's solutions are fast and decisive. Morty's are slower but less corrosive. Over time, corrosive solutions reduce the number of viable moves available. Stabilizing solutions preserve options. This distinction becomes important when considering longevity. Rick survives by burning bridges and moving on. Morty survives by learning how not to need to move on as often. Each universe abandoned narrows Rick's emotional and strategic range. Morty's willingness to remain present, even when uncomfortable, expands his. Surpassing Rick in this sense becomes a matter of endurance rather than conquest. Rick's difficulty with endurance is subtle, but persistent. He avoids prolonged exposure to unresolved states. He seeks closure through destruction or escape. Morty learns to exist within unresolved states. He carries uncertainty forward rather than eliminating it. This allows Morty to function in situations Rick would abandon prematurely. Over time, those situations accumulate. Rick's awareness of this gap creates tension rather than correction. He cannot teach Morty to stop evolving without undermining his own survival. He cannot evolve alongside Morty without confronting the limitations of his past choices. The result is stasis on Rick's side and motion on Morty's. As long as that imbalance persists, the trajectory favors Morty in subtle ways. Morty's surpassing, if it continues, will likely appear first in contexts Rick devalues. Emotional intelligence, alliance building, restraint, and long-term consequence management are not domains Rick prioritizes. Morty increasingly does. These domains rarely decide outcomes immediately, but they shape the environment in which future outcomes occur. Control over environment eventually outweighs control over events. Rick's reliance on improvisation also becomes less dominant as Morty's foresight improves. Improvisation excels when others are unprepared. Morty's growing preparedness reduces Rick's relative edge. Morty anticipates patterns Rick once monopolized. He does not outthink Rick, but he stops being surprised by him. That alone changes the balance. Importantly, Morty does not need Rick to fail for this shift to occur. Rick can remain brilliant, dangerous, and effective. Morty's growth does not require Rick's decline. It only requires Rick's inability to expand into domains he has already dismissed. Canon suggests that dismissal is one of Rick's most consistent traits. As Morty continues to integrate experience, his decision-making becomes less reactive to Rick's presence. He does not define success as keeping up with Rick or proving himself against him. He defines it as minimizing harm while maintaining viability. This definition reshapes priorities. Rick's victories often come at a cost Morty is no longer willing to ignore. That divergence creates space for different kinds of success. The longer this dynamic persists, the less meaningful raw superiority becomes. Rick can still overpower Morty in direct confrontation. Morty's advantage lies elsewhere. He becomes better at choosing which confrontations matter. Avoiding unnecessary conflict is itself a form of power Rick rarely exercises. Surpassing Rick, then, does not hinge on a future moment where Morty stands above him. It unfolds through incremental redistribution of influence. Rick remains dominant in moments of crisis. Morty becomes dominant in shaping what counts as a crisis. Over time, that distinction grows. As long as Morty continues adapting, and Rick remains anchored to a fixed survival strategy, the balance will keep shifting in quiet, unremarkable ways. No single episode will declare it. No character will name it. It will simply become increasingly clear that Rick's way of surviving is no longer the only one in the room. And once that happens, superiority becomes contextual rather than absolute. Not because Rick has fallen, but because Morty has learned how to stand. That standing position changes how every future interaction functions, even when nothing explicit is said. Morty no longer approaches Rick as an unquestionable constant in the universe. He treats Rick as a powerful variable, one that must be accounted for, but not obeyed reflexively. This shift alters Morty's risk calculations. Rick's presence becomes a factor, not a solution. Once that happens, Morty's dependence drops sharply. Rick notices this immediately, because Rick understands variables better than anyone. He senses when he is no longer the central axis around which decisions rotate. Morty still listens, still observes, still uses Rick's knowledge when it is useful, but he no longer structures his actions around Rick's approval or intervention. That decoupling is subtle, but it changes leverage. Rick's influence becomes conditional rather than assumed. Morty's growing ability to contextualize Rick's intelligence is crucial here. Early, Morty treated intelligence as authority. Later, Morty treats it as a tool set. Rick's answers are no longer definitive, only informative. Morty weighs them against situational cost, ethical trade-offs, and long-term consequences. This evaluative posture is something Rick applies to others, but resists having applied to himself. Seeing it reflected back destabilizes him. Rick's strategies increasingly rely on speed and overwhelm, not because they are superior, but because they bypass deliberation. Morty's deliberation slows these strategies down. He introduces friction into systems Rick prefers to dominate quickly. That friction does not stop Rick, but it alters outcomes. Rick's victories become less clean. They solve immediate problems while leaving unresolved secondary effects. Morty continues to track. Tracking consequences is one of Morty's most underappreciated strengths. Rick treats consequences as obstacles to escape. Morty treats them as data. He remembers what collateral damage leads to later instability. He notices which shortcuts create recurring threats. Over time, this memory builds an internal map Rick lacks, because Rick resets environments rather than inhabiting them. Morty inhabits consequences long enough to learn from them. This difference becomes more pronounced as stakes escalate. In low-stakes chaos, Rick's approach dominates. In sustained high-stakes environments, Morty's endurance becomes more effective. Rick burns through options quickly. Morty preserves them. Preservation matters when exits disappear. Rick's difficulty adapting to this shift comes from his relationship with time. Rick experienced time as something to outrun or bypass. Morty experienced time as something to endure. These orientations produce different survival strategies. Rick's intelligence compresses time. Morty's adaptability stretches it. As situations grow more prolonged and less escapable, stretching time becomes advantageous. Morty's willingness to remain present also changes how others respond to him. He becomes a point of continuity in unstable settings. Characters trust him not because he is dominant, but because he does not disappear when things get complicated. Rick's habit of leaving undermines trust even when his solutions work. Morty's habit of staying builds influence without confrontation. Influence, in this context, begins to matter more than dominance. Rick dominates scenarios. Morty influences trajectories. Dominance resolves moments. Influence shapes sequences. Over time, sequences outweigh moments. Morty's actions ripple forward in ways Rick's often do not, because Rick abandons the aftermath. Rick recognizes this pattern, but resists its implications. Acknowledging Morty's growing influence would require acknowledging that Rick's own approach has limits beyond intellect. Rick prefers to believe that limits are imposed externally, not internally. Morty's continued effectiveness challenges that belief quietly, without argument. Morty's surpassing of Rick, if it continues, will emerge first in environments Rick cannot simply leave. Situations involving sustained relationships, long-term instability, or layered moral complexity favor Morty's skill set. Rick remains unmatched in crises that can be solved decisively. Morty becomes more reliable in crises that cannot be solved at all, only managed. This distinction grows sharper as the series progresses. The multiverse becomes less forgiving. Structural safety nets erode. Replacements fail to erase loss. In these conditions, Rick's escape-based survival becomes riskier. Morty's endurance-based survival becomes sturdier. Neither approach disappears, but their relative value shifts. Rick's frustration with this shift manifests as increased irony, dismissal, and performative detachment. These behaviors mask a deeper recognition. Morty is no longer measuring himself against Rick. Morty measures himself against outcomes. That change removes Rick from the center of Morty's self-evaluation entirely. Once Rick is no longer the benchmark, surpassing becomes inevitable in certain domains. Morty stops trying to be better than Rick and starts trying to be sufficient for the situation at hand. Sufficiency, when repeated consistently, accumulates into reliability. Reliability outlasts brilliance when conditions worsen. Rick's brilliance remains undeniable. What changes is its exclusivity. Morty's growing reliability offers an alternative model of effectiveness. The presence of an alternative weakens monopoly. Rick's intelligence is still extraordinary, but it is no longer singular in determining survival. This does not produce a clean inversion of power. It produces overlap. Domains where Rick dominates shrink slightly. Domains where Morty excels expand quietly. No announcement marks this redistribution. It becomes visible only through repeated outcomes, as long as Morty continues to adapt and Rick continues to resist internal change. This redistribution will persist. Surpassing, in this context, is not a finish line. It is a gradual shift in where advantage resides. And that shift does not require Rick to fall. It only requires Morty to keep growing. That growth continues to reframe how conflict itself functions between them. Morty no longer experiences conflict as something to survive at all costs. He experiences it as something to manage. This shift alters his priorities. Instead of focusing on escape or domination, Morty begins prioritizing stability, even if that stability is temporary or imperfect. Rick's solutions often end conflict by overwhelming it. Morty's solutions often reduce conflict by containing it. Over time, containment proves more sustainable than annihilation. Rick's instinct to escalate stems from confidence in his ability to control outcomes once force is applied. Morty learns that force creates secondary effects Rick rarely accounts for. These effects do not always surface immediately, but they accumulate. Morty becomes sensitive to this accumulation. He begins factoring in delayed consequences, not because he can calculate them precisely, but because he has learned to expect them. Expectation itself becomes a strategic asset. This sensitivity reshapes Morty's decision-making under pressure. Where Rick defaults to maximum leverage, Morty defaults to minimum necessary action. He learns to ask not what can be done, but what must be done. That distinction changes outcomes. Rick often oversolves problems. Morty solves them just enough to move forward. In complex environments, oversolving destabilizes systems. Adequate solving preserves them. Morty's ability to preserve systems rather than replace them gives him leverage. Rick lacks. Rick's dominance relies on the assumption that anything broken can be swapped out. As replacement becomes less viable, that assumption weakens. Morty's approach gains relative strength. He treats continuity as a resource. Rick treats it as disposable. When disposability becomes costly, Morty's valuation proves more accurate. Rick's difficulty adjusting to this shift is rooted in his distrust of incremental solutions. He prefers definitive outcomes. Morty accepts partial resolution as meaningful. This acceptance allows Morty to function in spaces Rick finds intolerable. Rick escapes unresolved tension. Morty inhabits it. In doing so, Morty gains familiarity with instability that Rick actively avoids. This familiarity reduces Morty's dependence on control. He no longer needs certainty to act. He needs context. Rick's intelligence excels at producing certainty when possible. Morty's adaptability excels at functioning without it. As the series increasingly depicts situations where certainty is unavailable, Morty's skill set aligns more closely with reality. Rick's attempts to reassert advantage often involve narrowing the frame. He reduces complex situations to solvable problems. Morty resists this reduction. He maintains awareness of elements Rick brackets out. This broader framing slows action, but improves accuracy. Over time, accuracy begins to outweigh speed in determining survival. Morty's ability to operate within moral ambiguity also becomes more refined. Early, Morty struggled with ambiguity because it conflicted with his desire for clear right and wrong. Later, Morty accepts ambiguity without surrendering values. He understands that choosing the least harmful option does not equate to endorsing harm. Rick often rejects this distinction. He treats compromise as capitulation. Morty treats it as calibration. This difference influences how each character approaches loss. Rick avoids loss by leaving. Morty accepts loss as part of continuation. This acceptance allows Morty to remain engaged in environments Rick abandons prematurely. Over time, environments Rick leaves behind collapse or escalate in his absence. Morty's presence, by contrast, often dampens escalation. This pattern reinforces Morty's effectiveness in sustained contexts. Rick recognizes Morty's growing competence, but cannot fully integrate it into his self-concept. Acknowledging Morty's superiority in certain domains would require acknowledging that Rick's priorities are incomplete. Rick prefers to interpret Morty's successes as situational rather than structural. This interpretation allows Rick to preserve his identity without revising it. Morty does not require Rick's acknowledgement to continue improving. His feedback loop is internal. He evaluates outcomes based on harm reduced, stability maintained, and continuity preserved. These metrics differ from Rick's, but become increasingly relevant as the narrative emphasizes long-term consequence. Morty's metrics align with endurance rather than spectacle. As Morty's internal criteria solidify, his behavior becomes more consistent. Consistency builds trust. Trust alters environments. Rick's inconsistency destabilizes trust even when his solutions work. Morty's reliability creates predictability without rigidity. This predictability allows others to coordinate around him. Rick often operates alone because coordination constrains his freedom. Morty benefits from coordination because it distributes burden. Distributed burden reduces risk. Rick absorbs risk personally, then escapes when overwhelmed. Morty spreads risk across systems and relationships. This difference does not make Morty safer in the short term, but it makes systems around him more resilient. Over time, resilient systems outlast singular brilliance. Rick's reluctance to invest in resilience stems from his belief that resilience delays the inevitable. Morty's experience suggests otherwise. He sees that resilience buys time, and time allows adaptation. Rick compresses time to reach resolution. Morty stretches time to allow change. These temporal strategies produce different futures. The longer this dynamic persists, the clearer it becomes that surpassing Rick does not require overt competition. Morty's influence expands in spaces Rick neglects. Rick remains dominant, where force and intellect decide outcomes quickly. Morty becomes dominant where outcomes unfold slowly and resist simplification. This redistribution does not eliminate Rick's power. It contextualizes it. Rick's intelligence becomes one asset among others rather than the defining one. Morty's growth introduces a competing model of effectiveness. As both models coexist, the question of superiority loses clarity. What remains clear is direction. Morty continues to accumulate skills Rick no longer prioritizes. Rick continues to refine tools Morty does not rely on. The overlap between them grows narrower in some areas and wider in others. This shifting overlap defines the evolving balance. As long as Morty keeps adapting and Rick remains anchored to a fixed identity, the conditions for surpassing remain active, not as an endpoint, but as an ongoing reconfiguration of advantage that unfolds without fanfare. The process continues, episode after episode, shaped less by confrontation than by quiet adjustment, where influence moves not through victory, but through persistence. That persistence gradually changes what success looks like inside the story. Rick's successes are still spectacular, immediate, and decisive, but they increasingly feel isolated. They solve the present moment while leaving the future unchanged or more fragile. Morty's successes, by contrast, are quieter. They often look incomplete or unsatisfying in the short term, yet they alter the conditions that future problems emerge from. Over time, altering conditions becomes more powerful than resolving individual crises. Morty's growing sensitivity to context allows him to recognize when a problem is not meant to be solved, only stabilized. Rick rejects this idea instinctively. To Rick, an unsolved problem is a personal failure. To Morty, an unsolved problem can be a managed one. This philosophical difference shapes how each responds to complexity. Rick attacks complexity to eliminate it. Morty absorbs complexity and learns to operate within it. The latter approach scales more effectively as systems grow layered and interconnected. Rick's intelligence excels in environments that reward optimization. Morty's adaptability excels in environments that resist it. As the series increasingly presents moral, social, and psychological dilemmas rather than purely technical ones, Morty's skill set aligns more closely with the challenges at hand. Rick can still build solutions faster than anyone else, but those solutions often ignore variables Morty now considers essential. Morty's willingness to account for emotional fallout becomes a tactical advantage. Rick often treats emotional response as noise that interferes with efficiency. Morty treats it as signal. He anticipates how fear, loyalty, resentment, and hope will alter behavior. This allows him to make decisions that prevent escalation Rick would otherwise trigger. In volatile systems, preventing escalation is often more effective than overpowering it. Rick's difficulty here is not ignorance, but dismissal. He understands these dynamics intellectually, yet he refuses to center them. He considers them secondary concerns. Morty increasingly treats them as primary. This difference changes outcomes over time. Rick's solutions end conflicts. Morty's solutions reshape relationships. Ending a conflict does not guarantee stability. Reshaping relationships sometimes does. Morty's growing capacity to operate without spectacle also reduces his visibility as a threat. Rick's power announces itself. Morty's power accumulates quietly. This asymmetry allows Morty to influence outcomes without drawing the attention Rick inevitably attracts. Rick becomes a focal point for opposition simply by existing. Morty often passes beneath notice, altering trajectories without becoming a target. This invisibility is not weakness, it is leverage. Rick's reliance on intimidation further limits his adaptability. Intimidation creates compliance, but erodes trust. Morty's restraint fosters trust without demanding obedience. Trust produces cooperation that persists beyond immediate pressure. Rick rarely benefits from such cooperation because he does not value its maintenance. Morty increasingly does. As networks of cooperation expand, Morty's influence grows without requiring domination. The longer Morty operates this way, the more his presence stabilizes systems. Rick destabilizes. Rick thrives in disruption, because disruption resets power hierarchies. Morty thrives in continuity, because continuity allows learning. Disruption favors intelligence. Continuity favors adaptation. As the narrative shifts toward longer arcs and lasting consequences, continuity becomes harder to avoid. Rick's attempts to regain primacy often involve accelerating stakes. He raises danger levels to environments where his superiority is most pronounced. Morty's response is not to compete at that level, but to reroute around it. He avoids unnecessary escalation rather than matching it. This avoidance denies Rick the arena where he dominates most clearly. Morty does not challenge Rick on Rick's terms. He changes the terms. Changing the terms is the most significant indicator of surpassing. Rick's power depends on defining the game. Morty's growth allows him to opt out of games that cannot be won sustainably. This refusal does not defeat Rick, but it limits Rick's reach. Rick remains dominant in arenas Morty chooses not to enter. Morty becomes dominant in arenas Rick neglects. Morty's expanding influence also alters how failure functions. Rick treats failure as intolerable and erases it when possible. Morty treats failure as information and integrates it. This integration improves future decision-making. Over time, this learning loop compounds. Rick's erasure loop preserves identity, but prevents refinement. Morty's learning loop reshapes identity, but increases competence. As these loops continue, the gap between raw intelligence and applied effectiveness narrows. Rick still understands more. Morty increasingly applies what he understands more consistently. In systems defined by repetition and consequence, consistency outperforms brilliance. Morty's strength emerges not from singular insight, but from accumulated adjustment. Rick's awareness of this trend remains partial and conflicted. He senses the shift, but attributes it to circumstance rather than trajectory. This misattribution delays adaptation. Morty does not need Rick to recognize the shift for it to continue. His feedback mechanisms do not rely on Rick's approval. They rely on outcome evaluation. Morty's surpassing, if it continues, will be asymmetrical. He will not replace Rick as the axis of chaos. He will replace Rick as the axis of continuity. Chaos remains Rick's domain. Continuity becomes Morty's. As the story increasingly emphasizes lasting impact, continuity grows more consequential. Rick's intelligence allows him to win moments. Morty's adaptability allows him to shape sequences. Moments are visible. Sequences determine futures. This difference explains why Morty's growth is easy to overlook, while Rick's power remains obvious. Obvious power is not always decisive power. As long as Morty continues refining judgment, restraint, and endurance, his relevance will increase in ways Rick cannot fully counter. Rick's superiority remains intact, where the world behaves like a problem to be solved. Morty's superiority grows where the world behaves like a condition to be lived in. The series does not force a conclusion, because the comparison is not complete. Morty is still growing. Rick is still resisting change. That asymmetry keeps the question active without resolving it. Surpassing is not a destination. It is an ongoing redistribution of advantage that unfolds as conditions evolve. And as those conditions continue to shift, the balance between intelligence and adaptability keeps tilting quietly, without requiring a decisive moment to make it real. That quiet tilt continues to affect how authority is exercised and perceived. Rick's authority once came from being the only one who could see the whole board. Morty's growing competence does not challenge that vision directly, but it narrows the gap between seeing and responding. Morty no longer needs the full board to act effectively. He needs enough context to make decisions that do not collapse under pressure. This partial but sufficient awareness weakens Rick's monopoly on foresight. Rick's reliance on extreme solutions increasingly exposes their fragility. When every problem is treated as catastrophic, escalation becomes routine. Routine escalation dulls its own effectiveness. Morty notices this erosion. He begins reserving escalation for situations that truly require it. This selectivity increases impact when force is applied and reduces collateral when it is not. Rick's constant readiness becomes noise. Morty's restraint becomes signal. Morty's tolerance for delayed gratification further distinguishes his trajectory. Rick seeks immediate resolution, often because lingering uncertainty triggers discomfort. Morty learns to tolerate unresolved states if they preserve future options. This patience allows Morty to operate in longer arcs, where Rick's impatience leads to abandonment. Over time, those longer arcs become the primary narrative space. Short-term dominance loses leverage when consequences stretch beyond immediate control. Rick's difficulty with shared agency also limits his adaptability. He prefers unilateral action because it guarantees alignment with his intent. Morty, increasingly, works through shared agency, distributing decision-making across relationships. This approach reduces individual burden and increases resilience. Rick distrusts this model because it constrains freedom. Morty values it because it stabilizes outcomes. In unstable systems, stabilization outperforms autonomy. Morty's increasing comfort with incomplete information also shifts how problems are approached. Rick seeks total understanding before acting or forces action to bypass uncertainty. Morty accepts partial understanding and adjusts mid-course. This iterative approach aligns better with environments that change faster than they can be fully modeled. Rick's intelligence excels at static puzzles. Morty's adaptability excels at moving targets. As Morty refines this iterative mindset, his decisions become less brittle. They can absorb error without collapse. Rick's decisions, while brilliant, often hinge on precision. When precision fails, consequences escalate quickly. Morty's margin for error is wider because his plans assume imperfection. This tolerance for error becomes increasingly valuable as systems grow more chaotic. Rick's attempts to reassert superiority often involve increasing complexity beyond Morty's experience. He introduces layers of abstraction, advanced technology, and multiversal manipulation. Morty responds not by matching complexity, but by simplifying objectives. He focuses on what must be preserved rather than what can be optimized. This simplification does not negate Rick's advantage, but it reduces its relevance in certain contexts. Morty's simplification also affects moral calculus. Rick often justifies extreme actions through abstraction, framing harm as statistical inevitability. Morty grounds decisions in immediate impact. He does not deny scale, but he refuses to let scale erase responsibility. This grounding influences behavior in ways Rick's abstractions cannot easily counter. People respond differently to someone who acknowledges cost than to someone who dismisses it as necessary. Rick's pattern of detachment increasingly isolates him from feedback. He rarely receives honest responses because his presence distorts behavior. Morty, by contrast, receives feedback more readily. Others react authentically to him because he does not dominate interactions. This feedback loop accelerates learning. Rick's insulation slows it. Over time, feedback becomes more valuable than foresight. Morty's expanding role as an intermediary further reshapes influence. He often translates between Rick's logic and others' emotional realities. This translation is a form of power Rick does not possess. Rick communicates through assertion. Morty communicates through alignment. Alignment sustains cooperation longer than coercion. As cooperative structures become more necessary, Morty's role becomes harder to replace. Rick's resistance to internal change remains the limiting factor. He understands the shifts occurring around him, but refuses to integrate them. Morty integrates continuously. This asymmetry ensures that even if Rick remains superior in raw capability, Morty's relative effectiveness continues to rise in contexts Rick undervalues. Morty's surpassing if described accurately, is not a vertical ascent above Rick. It is a lateral expansion into spaces Rick abandoned. Rick dominates the extremes. Morty occupies the in-between. As the narrative increasingly explores those in-between spaces, Morty's relevance grows. This expansion does not diminish Rick's importance. It reframes it. Rick becomes one force among several shaping outcomes, rather than the sole driver. Morty's growth contributes to this decentralization. Authority disperses. Influence becomes contextual. As this dispersion continues, moments where Rick's approach is unquestionably superior become rarer, not because Rick weakens, but because the environment no longer favors singular dominance. Morty's adaptability aligns more closely with this distributed reality. The process remains ongoing. Morty continues learning through exposure. Rick continues refining within limits he set long ago. The balance shifts incrementally, shaped by decisions made under pressure, rather than declarations of superiority. Each adjustment, each restraint, each recalibration adds weight to Morty's trajectory, not as a challenger seeking to surpass Rick outright, but as a presence whose effectiveness no longer depends on Rick's shadow. And as long as that independence continues to deepen, the redistribution of advantage remains in motion, reshaping the dynamic without ever needing to announce itself. That redistribution also alters how failure is processed between them. Rick treats failure as something to erase or outrun, which keeps his self-image intact but limits integration. Morty treats failure as something to catalog. He remembers what went wrong, how it felt, and what it cost others. This memory is not sentimental. It is functional. It informs future restraint and shapes judgment in ways Rick's clean resets never allow. Because Morty carries failure forward, his decisions gradually become more conservative in the best sense of the word. He expends force only where it produces durable outcomes. Rick expends force where it proves superiority. The difference becomes visible when similar situations recur. Rick solves them faster. Morty solves them with fewer aftershocks. Over repetition, reduced aftershocks matter more than speed. Morty's growing awareness of ripple effects introduces a kind of strategic patience Rick rarely practices. Rick values decisiveness. Morty values timing. He learns that acting too early can be as damaging as acting too late. This sensitivity allows Morty to intervene at moments Rick overlooks because they do not register as critical yet. Morty's interventions often prevent escalation rather than responding to it. Preventing escalation is invisible when it works, which makes Morty's influence easy to underestimate. Rick's dominance has always depended on visibility. His intelligence announces itself. His victories are unmistakable. Morty's effectiveness hides inside continuity. When things do not fall apart, Morty's contribution is difficult to isolate. This asymmetry allows Morty to grow without triggering direct resistance. Rick reacts to threats he can see. Morty's growth is not framed as a threat. It is framed as utility. That utility reshapes Rick's dependence. Rick increasingly relies on Morty, not just as camouflage or ballast, but as a stabilizing factor. Morty absorbs uncertainty. Rick refuses to carry. He handles interpersonal fallout. Rick avoids. He manages lingering consequences Rick would abandon. Rick may not acknowledge this reliance, but behavior reflects it. Tasks drift toward Morty that require endurance rather than brilliance. Morty's endurance also changes how responsibility is distributed. Rick prefers centralized control because it preserves autonomy. Morty disperses responsibility because it preserves systems. This dispersion creates redundancy. When one element fails, others compensate. Rick's systems fail catastrophically when they fail at all. Morty's systems fail gradually, allowing correction. Gradual failure is survivable. Catastrophic failure demands escape. Rick's instinct to escape rather than repair becomes increasingly costly as safe exits diminish. Morty's instinct to repair rather than escape becomes increasingly valuable. Repair does not restore things to their original state, but it maintains enough continuity for learning to persist. Rick's escapes prevent learning by removing context. Morty's repairs preserve context even when imperfect. Morty's capacity to tolerate imperfection further distinguishes his trajectory. Rick seeks optimal solutions. Morty seeks workable ones. Optimal solutions fail when conditions change. Workable solutions adapt. Morty's tolerance for good enough outcomes keeps systems flexible. Rick's pursuit of perfection locks him into brittle strategies that assume static conditions. As Morty continues refining this approach, his decisions increasingly influence not just immediate outcomes, but future decision spaces. He leaves more options open. Rick closes options decisively. Closing options feels powerful in the moment. Leaving them open becomes powerful over time. Morty's growing influence lies in this temporal dimension Rick undervalues. Rick's awareness of Morty's growing role remains conflicted. He recognizes competence, but resists dependency. He alternates between delegating and undermining. This inconsistency reveals internal tension rather than strategy. Rick cannot fully suppress Morty's growth without harming his own survival. He cannot fully support it without undermining his identity. The result is a fragile equilibrium where Morty's influence expands quietly. Morty's surpassing, if framed accurately, is not about replacing Rick as the most capable individual. It is about reducing the number of situations where Rick's approach is uniquely effective. Each time Morty resolves a problem without escalation, Rick's monopoly shrinks slightly. Each time Morty stabilizes a system Rick would abandon, the value of Rick's exit strategy diminishes. This does not diminish Rick's intelligence. It contextualizes it. Rick's genius remains unmatched in domains that reward speed, abstraction, and force. Morty's competence grows in domains that reward patience, presence, and adaptation. As the narrative increasingly explores those domains, Morty's relevance expands. Morty's ability to function without spectacle also alters narrative gravity. Rick draws attention. Morty redirects it. Rick's presence warps environments. Morty's presence smooths them. Over time, environments that can tolerate Rick become rarer. Environments that benefit from Morty become more common. This shift does not happen suddenly. It accumulates. Rick's reluctance to engage in this accumulation stems from his discomfort with gradual change. He prefers decisive moments because they can be controlled or escaped. Morty operates comfortably in gradients. He accepts that influence grows slowly and unevenly. This acceptance allows Morty to invest in long arcs. Rick dismisses as inefficient. As these arcs extend, Morty's internal compass becomes more reliable than Rick's improvisation in certain contexts. Rick improvises brilliantly when rules are clear. Morty adapts steadily when rules are unclear. The latter condition becomes increasingly prevalent. Rick's solutions remain impressive, but Morty's become dependable. Dependability alters power dynamics quietly. Those around Morty begin to anticipate his presence rather than react to it. They adjust behavior proactively. Rick's presence triggers reaction rather than anticipation. Reaction consumes energy. Anticipation conserves it. Over time, conserved energy becomes advantage. Morty's surpassing, therefore, is not an event to be marked, but a pattern to be noticed. It emerges through repeated alignment between Morty's approach and environmental demands. Rick remains formidable, but less singular. Morty becomes influential without seeking dominance. As long as Morty continues integrating experience, and Rick continues relying on established patterns, this alignment persists. The balance does not flip. It redistributes. Advantage migrates across domains without fanfare, and that migration continues, shaped not by who is smarter, but by whose way of surviving remains functional as conditions refuse to stabilize. That functionality reshapes how both characters relate to uncertainty. Rick experiences uncertainty as an obstacle to be eliminated. He either gathers enough data to collapse it into certainty, or applies force to bypass it entirely. Morty, through repeated exposure, learns to coexist with uncertainty without needing to resolve it immediately. This coexistence allows him to remain effective even when information is incomplete or contradictory. In volatile systems, the ability to function without clarity becomes as valuable as clarity itself. Morty's increasing comfort with uncertainty also changes how he allocates attention. Rick focuses intensely on dominant variables, often ignoring secondary effects until they become threats. Morty distributes attention more evenly. He monitors peripheral signals, small shifts in behavior, and early signs of instability. These signals rarely demand action on their own, but together they inform timing. Acting at the right moment often matters more than acting with maximum force. Rick's solutions tend to compress complexity into solvable cores. Morty's solutions often accept complexity as irreducible. Rather than forcing coherence, Morty works around incoherence. This difference allows Morty to operate in environments Rick finds intolerable. Rick's impatience with messiness leads him to abandon contexts Morty can still navigate. Each abandonment reduces Rick's experiential range and increases Morty's relative familiarity with unstable spaces. Morty's growing familiarity with instability affects his emotional responses as well. Early, Morty was overwhelmed by chaos because it felt personal and endless. Later, Morty recognizes chaos as structural rather than intentional. This reframing reduces panic and enables proportional response. Rick has always understood chaos structurally, but he responds to it with contempt rather than calibration. Morty responds with adjustment. Adjustment preserves energy. Rick expends unnecessarily. Energy conservation becomes increasingly relevant as pressures accumulate. Rick operates at high intensity by default. His brilliance compensates for the cost, but the cost remains. Morty learns to modulate intensity. He escalates selectively, conserving emotional and cognitive resources for prolonged engagement. In drawn-out scenarios, this modulation proves advantageous. Rick burns bright. Morty burns steadily. Morty's steadiness also affects how others behave around him. People adjust expectations downward around Rick. bracing for volatility. Around Morty, expectations stabilize. This stabilization reduces friction and allows cooperation to persist longer. Rick's volatility can achieve compliance quickly, but it erodes willingness over time. Morty's consistency fosters willingness even when outcomes are uncertain. Rick's resistance to this dynamic stems from his association of stability with stagnation. He fears that slowing down or tolerating uncertainty will trap him. Morty's experience suggests the opposite. Stability creates space to maneuver. Stagnation arises from refusal to adjust, not from patience. Morty adjusts continuously, even when movement is minimal. Rick adjusts only when forced. As Morty's pattern of adjustment becomes habitual, his decision-making gains coherence across contexts. He develops transferable judgment rather than situational hacks. Rick excels at hacks. Morty excels at frameworks. Frameworks endure when contexts change. Hacks must be reinvented repeatedly. Over time, reinvention costs more than refinement. Morty's frameworks integrate moral, social, and practical considerations into a single evaluative process. Rick separates these domains, prioritizing practical outcome over moral coherence. Morty's integration reduces internal conflict during decision-making. Rick's separation accelerates action but increases long-term instability. Integrated judgment slows decisions slightly but improves alignment over time. Rick's awareness of this divergence remains partial. He notices that Morty's choices often work, but he attributes success to luck, context, or Rick's unseen influence. This attribution protects Rick's self-image, but delays learning. Morty does not require attribution to continue refining his approach. His feedback loop is internal and self-correcting. As Morty's internal framework strengthens, his responses become less reactive to Rick's presence. Rick can still influence outcomes, but he no longer defines them. Morty anticipates Rick's moves and adjusts accordingly. This anticipation reduces surprise. Surprise is Rick's leverage. As surprise diminishes, so does Rick's relative advantage. Rick responds by increasing unpredictability, introducing chaos to reassert control. Morty counters not by matching chaos, but by reducing its impact. He focuses on preserving core objectives regardless of disruption. This focus limits chaos's reach. Rick's unpredictability loses potency when its effects are contained. Morty's containment strategy relies on prioritization. He distinguishes between critical and non-critical outcomes more effectively over time. Rick often treats all obstacles as critical challenges to his dominance. Morty treats many obstacles as noise. Filtering noise preserves clarity. Rick's engagement with noise drains resources. Morty's growing ability to filter also affects emotional load. He no longer internalizes every failure or threat. He accepts that some losses are unavoidable and does not personalize them. Rick's detachment achieves a similar effect, but through negation rather than acceptance. Morty's acceptance preserves learning. Rick's negation preserves distance. As these differences compound, the functional gap between raw intelligence and applied effectiveness narrows further. Rick remains capable of extraordinary feats. Morty becomes capable of sustained navigation. In environments defined by ongoing instability rather than discrete crises, sustained navigation becomes decisive. The narrative does not require Morty to surpass Rick in a definitive sense for this shift to matter. It only requires Morty's approach to remain viable, where Rick's becomes costly. That viability continues to increase as Morty integrates experience across episodes and contexts. Rick's reluctance to revise his identity remains the primary limiting factor. He could, in theory, adopt aspects of Morty's approach. He understands them intellectually. What he resists is the vulnerability inherent in change. Morty embraces that vulnerability by default. This openness accelerates growth even when outcomes are uncertain. As Morty continues to operate within this openness, his adaptability deepens. He becomes less dependent on any single strategy. Rick remains bound to brilliance. Morty becomes fluent in adjustment. Fluency outlasts brilliance when conditions refuse to stabilize. This ongoing divergence does not culminate in confrontation. It manifests through accumulation. Morty's decisions reshape context gradually. Rick's decisions resolve moments sharply. Over time, contexts matter more than moments. The environment shifts in ways that favor Morty's skill set without displacing Rick entirely. The balance continues to redistribute across domains. Rick remains dominant in extremes. Morty gains influence in continuities. Neither position negates the other. They coexist in tension, shaped by different responses to the same universe. And as long as Morty continues refining judgment, tolerance, and adaptability, while Rick remains anchored to fixed patterns, the conditions for surpassing remain active, unfolding quietly through use rather than declaration. And that question remains open, active, and unresolved precisely because the process has not stopped moving.